hopefully by now you
One
have
of
a
the
good
first
idea
questions
what
you might come up
requirements
with
are.
is, let's talk
What
about
are
how do we
software
get to
requirements? Why do we
capturing
care
these
about
things.
that? I
There's a
mean,
lot more
if you
details
sit
than I
down
can
with a problem,
possibly
I can
cover
just go
in
code that, right?
3
I've been
hours
doing
of
that
lectures
in
here.
class
There's
for
more
a while
reading
now.
you're
Well,
going to do and more
maybe,
stuff you can find out.
but
Let me give you a basic
fundamentally,
highlight of
we
some
don't
of the
always
approaches.
know what software
So
developers are
it's
supposed
really
to build.
important to start off
Somebody
that I
has to go
get
through and
all
figure
of
out
the stakeholders' views of
who
what they
really
think
wants
the
this
system's
and
going to
what
be.
really value is it
If not
adding
for any
to
other
them. We
reason,
need to
it's
make
just
sure
to
we're
check that
building
they're
the
on the
right
same
thing,
page.
essentially.
Even if they
So
give you a single document,
it
we
might
can
be
do that
worth
in a
having
ton of
specific
different ways. There's
interviews
so many different
to
methodologies.
follow
We're
up
going
on
to
that
talk about
document
them and
and
see
see
what
what
the different folks
but generally
are speaking.
saying,
We want to
um,
formally write down,
particularly in a big company,
these are the
if there's
people
a
we
lot
care
of stuff
about.
going around, many business
This is what
departments,
they
many
want.
technical
Maybe
departments,
even a little why
they
want
might
it.
not be communicating
And
properly. So if
then
you just
write it down in
trust,
such a way that we can lead
if you're not in the company
building
especially,
the software.
that they're
Now,
all
why
on
do
the
we
same
bother with
page,
that,
you
though?
might get
I mean,
burned.
it's
As
all
one
nice and good.
group
Why do I
might
get
be
happy
happy
with
with
implementation?
another one might not be.
Have
So
a
we want
conversation,
to bring
take some
all these
notes on a
different
napkin,
viewpoints
and
and
run from
kind
there.
of come up with a
Well,
cohesive
sometimes
model.
we do it
I
for
mean, one of the
contractual
things that
reasons.
I've always
If somebody's
believed
paying
in
us
is
to build
I
software,
don't
and I'm a
ever
software
let
developer,
somebody
and
else
you're
write
a
a
person
requirement
who
for me.
does banking,
That's not exactly true with me as an
defense
individual, but as a
contracting,
group,
airline reservations,
certainly,
things like
if somebody has a requirements document that's great, that's going to be an input to our
might
requirements
not want to
document.
hire
We
me
talked about before.
full-time.
We
You
want to
might
trace
not
where
want me to be
requirements
on your
came from.
payroll
Well, you have
full-time. You
yours.
just want to
and
have me
let's write
around,
our
build your
version
software, let me
of
go away.
what the requirements are going to be.
I might not
There's a
work
couple
for you
reasons we want to do
full-time.
that. We still have to
One
have some
is
way of knowing,
basically,
did I
do
build
we
what you
control
want?
the
And
verbiage
did you
that goes in
get
there?
what
We
you
make
asked for?
somebody
That
else
sort of
agree
thing.
to
There might be
what's
a
going
contractual
on.
reason we want
But
to do
less
formal requirements.
tactical.
But even
and,
without that, let's say I do work
mercenary
for
than
the
that.
bank. Let's
Is
say
it's
I
a
do
great
work
way
for the
just to
airlines.
restate
I
what's
do work
going on
for
with that. Now, again,
defense
it's not
contractors.
every situation. I'm not
Requirements are
saying
huge
I
there
work for a
because the
company, I'm going
government
to
doesn't
rewrite
want
what's
to
going
build their
on.
own stuff.
But I know the company I work
Part
for,
of
the
that
business
is
writes what
follow
we
through.
call business
So we
requirement
had an intent
document.
up front,
And then we write
do
what we
some
call the
design, we
technical
build some
response,
code,
which is
3,
basically
6,
our
9
version of
months, a year
requirements.
later.
Often
we hand
it's
it over
the
to a
same
testing
thing.
group.
Often
How
it's
do
just
they
like,
know
hey,
what
I'm
we
going to copy
planned to
and
do to
paste what
begin
they
with?
had.
How do they know
But
what
in
was
many times as
really
well,
the
it's
necessary
necessary
to
to
add
add
the
some
front
information.
features?
To
How
be
do I
able
know
to break
that what
it
I
up, talk about
got
how we're going
was
to
what I
implement that on
intended
our
to
side.
build? And
And
requirements
so
is one
there's
way to
something
do that.
about
It gives us
owning
a
it that we want to get
milestone by
everybody's
which we can
viewpoint and
track
make
things
it
all the way
our
through.
own.
So beyond that, what
Where
do
do these things
capture?
come from then?
Early on the
If there's
analysis phase,
occasionally
I'm
arbitrary,
not
we're not
worried about
entirely
jumping
sure.
straight
Well,
to
there's a lot of different sorts
you
of
shall
requirements.
and you
We
have
shan't and all that
some
sort of
cases
stuff like
we
that.
just
Being
go
formal.
and figure out a need.
I want to capture
Hey,
the environment where it sits.
in the bank,
What's going
I
on in
need
there? What
to
are the different
deposit
moving pieces?
checks.
Who are the
It takes
users?
a really
What's
long
the data?
time to type
What's
them
already
in.
existing? What are the
Let's
different
build
processes?
a
Who are the
other
image
software
systems
where I
that
can
I'm
scan
talking
it in
to
and
on
automatically
top
read what
of
somebody wrote in the
the
check. Wouldn't that be
actual
great?
implementation that you're being
That's a
asking
need.
for?
And then
Not
what are the
necessarily coming
responsibilities
from
that I would need
specific
that to
apps,
do?
but
What
most
does
of the
that
time we do
timeliness
have
of
things
those
like customers who
responsibilities?
say, hey, wouldn't it be great if
What
I could
makes
deposit this check
what does a
remotely? I can
successful
picture with
system
my cell
look like?
phone.
So I want to
Boom.
describe the
Have
environment,
that
as we said.
check I want to describe the data, the
deposit.
inputs and outputs.
Sometimes it's a
How am I
contract.
getting
We
data? Is it files
say,
that are being
hey,
sent to me? Is it
my bank wants to do
interfaces that are being
business
sent?
with
Is it user
this
interfaces?
supermarket
Are those
chain.
the web?
In order
Are
to do
those
business with the
users
supermarket
directly
chain, we
connected?
need
Are
to
those mobile applications?
accommodate
Something.
what are the behaviors
Yeah,
and what are the
there's some
functionality
contract that
that's
some
going
business
on?
needs
So
out there that I build
the
software for that
functions in this
reason.
case referring
And sometimes
to
it's laws.
I hit a
I've
button
been working
that
in
does this thing.
healthcare the
Behaviors
last
is,
couple of years.
oh,
and
I just
contracts and
ping it
laws,
randomly,
the
push
vast majority of the
notifications,
software
things
we
like
build.
that could be
When
considered
the Affordable
behaviors.
Care Act came out,
The other thing
tons
to
and tons of
consider
work
here
for us to
is
do. When
don't
they said there's
mistake
religious exceptions, tons and
software
tons and
requirements
tons of
for
work goes
system
to.
requirements.
Every time they change a law,
We kind
my
of talk
job
about them
employment goes
interchangeably.
up
The
and up and
approach
up.
is much the same.
So
but when I talk
there's
about a
all
system
sorts of
requirements,
drivers
the
for
system
software
shall do this, and
requirements,
this.
some
Like,
of which is really
you know,
not even an external driver. Sometimes
the
there's big
users shall be
projects where
notified
I have these
when
systems that get
when their
designed.
balance is
Defense
low on their bank
contracting
account.
is a great example of this.
It's a big
where
requirement.
I'm
How
going
are
to
they
build
notified?
a
I might send them an
joint
email,
strike
and an
fighter.
SMS message, it's a
And
push
it's going to have a
notification,
bunch of
a mobile
systems. There's
application.
going to be
If it is a
engines,
push
and there's going to
mobile
be
application,
avionics,
well,
and
there's
going to
two
be
sets of
missiles, and
requirements
there's going
there.
to be
On the
radar,
server,
there's going to be all these different
where
pieces.
and
Withdrawals
withdrawals
software
actually
sometimes
happen
is
from a
driven
bank
based
account,
off
I have to
of
have some
other
software
decisions
there
and have them
that
trickle
says,
down to
hey,
our
let's
stuff.
every time I
Sometimes it's driven
do
by
a
existing
withdrawal from an
components.
account, let's
Let's
see
go
if
a
the
different direction.
amount
So,
is below some threshold, and then
we're
flag
doing
it out.
a
And then I have to
project
send something
where
somewhere
in
else.
healthcare where we're
So let's
integrating
say
with
it's
a
a
debit
push
card. So you
notification.
can
Well,
run
what
your
if that
debit card,
user's
swipe a debit
mobile
card.
app
Some
isn't
of our
available
requirements are
right
driven
then?
by
How
the
do
way
I
that stuff is
know
implemented.
when to
It might not
resend
behave
that?
the way
How
we
does
want
I
it
get it
to,
to?
but
But
I
we
don't know
have
anything
to do
about
it
that
that way because
application.
then
The
I
way
have
it's already
another
built.
requirement
We've
on
already
the
selected a
push
solution
application
here,
is
and
on
we go
this
build
mobile
around
application
it in
is
that way.
either I have to have
So
a
requirements,
process
there's
running in
not
the background
a
of the
fixed
phone, or I have to wait
place,
until the
but
next time the
there's a
user
lot of
opens up
tricky things
the
that are
app.
coming
Or
up.
again,
And
think about this.
understanding
That's
where
a
they come from is
system
important
requirement
because
because you have to
it
understand
has
as
a
many
requirement,
software
or is
requirements
it a reality
that
of the
derive
current
from it.
situation?
So I have to also understand.
Sometimes you'll say,
the
like,
context in which
there's
I'm
lots of
talking when I
examples
talk
of
about
it. You may have heard the
requirements.
story of
I jump
young
ahead a little
lady
bit there, but
it's
when
asked her mom why she always cut the ends
so
off
the
of a
initial
ham every time they bake
information
the ham.
gathering for a
Yeah,
brand
there's
new
some-
project,
it's
first
just
time
like,
well,
project
it tastes
often
better
comes
that
from
way.
interview. When you cut the ends off. It's like,
Many,
well,
many
it makes
times
sense. Why did
software
everybody cut the
development
ends off
starts
ham?
with somebody
Why would
not
the
even
ham
knowing they
cut
need
with its
software
ends
development.
cut off?
I just have
And
this
so
problem.
she went and
I
asked
wanna go
grandma,
meet it.
why did you cut the
Or
ends
somebody
off the
says,
ham?
I want some
And she's
software.
like,
so
I don't
go
know.
build
My
me
mother
this.
always did it that way. Then
Well,
she goes and got
let
that
me
to
make
great
sure
grandma.
what you
Why did you
really
cut
want
the
here.
ends off the ham?
There's
Well,
cases
I had a
where
small
people go
oven
and build
when I was
software for
cooking it.
something
The
that
whole
never
ham
needed to be
would
built
fill
to
it in,
software.
so I cut the ends
Something
off
either
and
already exists
so it
or
fit in.
I can just do some manual
Again,
process to work
was it a
around
requirement
it, or
to cut
some
the
other
ends off
good
the
reason
ham?
we didn't need to build
Well,
software.
at the time it
part
was
of the
because it
job
was
of the requirement
small
analyst is
oven.
to ask some really clear
Down the
questions
line,
with the
3
ball rolling.
generations,
Either
you got
to
big ovens.
just
You don't need
spark
to cut
the
the
interest
ends
of
off
what
the
needs
ham.
to get done,
That's the sort of
or
thing. That's
to
why we want to know
clarify
where did they
what's
come
been
from?
asked for to
Why
see what the
have
real
we
need
decided to
behind
build
it
the
is.
system the way
You
we
have to be
decided to build
really
the
careful
system?
when a requirement
And
looks
so
really like obvious. that
Let's
this is
talk
what's
a
gonna be
little
done.
bit about where requirements
That can be a
come from
good
from the
thing
standpoint of
if there's enough
stakeholders.
documentation. You know,
There's
why
a lot of
this
different
gets
stakeholders.
to be
Anybody
done.
who's a
It
part of the
also could
project
be a
is
case of
technically a
somebody
stakeholder.
jumping to an answer.
But the ones
we
we get
really want
requirements
to
from,
make sure our requirements
starting
are not
with is
focused
generally
on
the users
how
and the people we're
job
buying
gets
from.
done, but what
maybe
needs to get done.
it's about needs, not about implementation.
Auditors or
in the
the
requirements
legal
phase.
aspects or things like that.
So within
But
that
the
initial
people who
interview,
say,
then,
what do we
want to
really
be very careful
and then
about
apply
how we
constraints on that.
go about the
So yeah,
questions.
what do I want? Well,
We
I want
wanna
a,
try and
phone
gather
app that does
information
this,
as
this,
natural
and this.
to that.
It doesn't
as
have to be a
possible.
phone
When we
app.
talk about modeling here in a minute,
That's
we
you know,
want to
you-
try and
that's what
write
we want to talk
requirements
about
in a way
is
that
stakeholders
captures
understand
the
well, do you think it
vocabulary
needs to be a
and
phone
the
app?
terms
Why do you
used
think
in
it
that
needs to be a phone app?
domain.
Because
We don't make
sometimes
up a new
well, I don't
language.
have a phone
We don't
app
have
because
something that doesn't mean
I have an
anything.
iPhone.
We don't
I
want
want
an
we
app
certainly
that
don't
does
want to capture
iPhone.
in technical
Can we do that
jargon.
with a
If
HTML5
they
web
talk
page
about
that somebody can pull up.
their
No, I want an
members,
app.
if they talk
Okay.
about their patients, if they
requirements
talk about
to have an
their
app.
consumers, we don't want to call them all users.
Want to have an app because
yeah, they are users. They
boss said so.
will be users of the system, but
So we want to
users
understand the stakeholders.
also
When they're
could
coming
be
from
system
where they're coming from.
administrators. It could be
We have internal
customer
stakeholders
service
as well.
managers.
Sometimes we have
So when
additional
we talk about
requirements based off of the needs
behavior,
of
we're
managing
talking about
the
in
terms
systems.
that mean
So
the
the
business.
users can
So we wanna-
go through
we
and
don't want to ask
reset their own
super
password
leading questions
using
about
implementation if we can
to
avoid it.
prompts for
We should then build upon
secret
follow-up
questions.
questions.
What's your mother's maiden
So your
name? That sort of
first
stuff.
tier of
But
questions
what happens
there
if they
should be
forget those?
understanding who the
Well,
customer
that
is.
means they have
what
to
are they
call
going to
customer
try and get
service
from the
and
system?
reset
What's
their
their goal
password
from the
through
system? What
a
benefits
manual
is it going to derive
verification.
from
Okay.
that?
Well, what's
If
the
they come
screens look
through
like
and say,
for that?
hey,
oh, we didn't put those
we
in
want
there.
this
Well,
to
there's
do
your
this,
requirement.
this, and this, and it's going to.
It's not a
hopefully
user requirement.
save
The
us
user can't do it,
$100,000
but
a year.
we have internal needs.
You can
for
say
that
to
sort
them,
of
like, well,
stuff.
it's going to cost
So we
a
want to
half
understand
$500,000
who are all the
to build this
stakeholders.
system.
Sometimes system
So if it's only saved
administration,
you
people who
$100,000
never
a
build the
year,
system at all,
is
needs
it
to be a
worth a
stakeholder
5-year
because
payback
if
on
they have
that?
data that needs to be encrypted,
And they're
they have
like,
to have
wow, well, I only thought
requirements
it
by
cost
which how is that
$50,000
data
to
going to be
build it.
encrypted?
So I thought
How are we
going
going
to
to manage
It's
that?
like, nope, that's not.
And so
software's expensive.
primarily, when we think of stakeholders, we think
So
of external
understanding that
stakeholders,
goal
the customers,
and
the
the
users,
benefits
the regulators,
and
the legal,
is really
the general
important
public,
to being able to
build
build
the
the
general
proper
public.
solution. You could end up
Well,
spending
if you have
$50,000 just to get the requirements done for
a
some
system
systems.
that keeps track of
So
all the
the
purchases
next
done
tier
at a major
is to
retailer,
understand
like say
the
Target.
specific problem and where the
If you
customer
ever shop at
perceives the
Target,
issue
you
with
certainly want to
that.
know your credit card data
So
was protected.
once we've
You certainly want to
established
know that
what the
terminal
goal is, let's talk
can't
about
have
what are the
viruses
issues
put
and
into it
what
that steals your
the
credit
customer
card data
perceives
along
the
the
issue
way.
as. Because again,
You don't work for
sometimes
Target,
the issue could
but you
be
still care about Target. Well,
bad
let's go
customer
beyond that.
service.
Let's
But
say you
the
live
issue
in
is
town,
not
you like to use
necessarily that
electricity,
customer
like so many of
service
us do.
is slow
Don't
or
you want
mean.
that
It
power
might
plant
be
to
the fact
have
that customer
certain
service
security
doesn't have
measures?
access
Don't
to
you
the
have
data
that
to be truly
power
useful.
plant have certain reliability
So
measures, certain
when they have
requirements
to go get
that
data, they've got to
makes
log
the
into 3
electricity
different
not
systems
stop
and do
working.
this, which
So you're
means
you know,
they're frustrated.
There's
and
general
the
public can be
person's been
impacted
waiting around
in
forever.
interesting
And
ways.
the correct
Let's
answer is
say you
not to
breathe
rebuild the system,
air.
just like
You
get rid
certainly
of some
want
of the slowdowns. inside the
Volvo
existing
not to
systems.
have, I think it was
Example
Volvo, but not to have
The
cars
next
that cheat on
level
emissions
then is to
tests.
go
There's
through
been,
and see how you're
you know,
doing.
some
Are you getting the
huge number of
information you
people
want?
who've
Are
been
people
thought to have
I mean,
gotten sick
real
because
simple
of the
test.
lead
Are people
coming gotta
excited
fill
to talk
pipes.
to you about it.
If you're getting a lot
You
of
don't
one-word,
get to
two-word
choose
answers,
whether or
like,
not you
yeah,
breathe
I
air.
guess
It's
that
there.
sounds good. Then you really
But
haven't
you could
engaged
be
people.
effective
You
with
haven't
software
really
requirements, so you need to
gotten to
understand
what's
that.
really their pain points.
Internal
that they really want
project,
to
we
talk
have people
about.
who
They
read the
really want
requirements
to try and get
analysts,
solved.
people who code
You
it,
might need
the administrators,
to
like we talked about,
reevaluate,
testers,
figure out what's
even
going
the
on,
management
figure out what
have
the
stakes in it.
enthusiasm is and what the issues are. If the
trick
system
here
you're
is
trying
not
to build
to
is going
ignore
to put
any of
people
these
out of
rules.
work,
It's to
well,
weigh
maybe
the
you need
rules
to
appropriately.
find a way to
Any one
either
role
get
shouldn't say,
different
I
people
want
to
it this
talk
way
to,
and it shall
or
be
better
done.
yet, show how
Outside of
that's
maybe
going to make
people
them
paying
more
for it.
productive so they can get
But
other stuff
even
done.
then, you want to have conversations.
So,
you want to go through. You want to document this information.
as
You
you're
want to know where
wrapping
it's
up the
coming from
interviews,
and
as you're getting
why.
through these interviews,
So as we go to capture
you're
the
going to
requirements,
have to
I
basically
have a bunch of general steps we want to consider here. We want
judge
to recognize what the problem really is. Talk
how
about that a
much
little
you can
bit.
keep
We'll go into
going
that a little more
by,
detail in a
how much
second.
time
We
people
want to
have
go evaluate
available,
what are the
how
options, what are the
comfortable they
different
are,
things,
how
what
much
do we
more
really need to
information
write
you're
down,
gathering.
do some
There's something
synthesis
called
to be able to
saturation.
pull
when
together
you're
all
doing
this stuff
and
where
figure out
you can
what's
keep going, but
on.
you're not
You
going to
don't
get much
just
more information.
start writing
For every
everything down.
hour
and go
you
from there.
spend,
We
you're
wanna
only
have
getting
some
5 minutes of new information.
kind of
that's going
clever
on
approach to
inside
there.
there.
And so
We
you
can
got to kind of
enhance that
figure out
through
a way
modeling.
where
knowing what we
you
want the
can
system to
get
do
good
isn't so
information,
bad.
get trustworthy information.
Knowing
you can
all
get
of what
them
we want the
built
system
in,
to do can be
buy
difficult.
into the process,
And
be able to
modeling can
really
help us get
use
through
their
that.
time well.
And we talk about
Don't just bring them in
specifications,
and
we're
say,
gonna
tell us
formal
about
about
everything.
it. We're going to actually write this
The
stuff
more
down.
structured, the
Wait a
more
minute. I thought we were always doing requirements.
systematic you are
It's like
to the
anything.
questions for
When
the
you start
approach,
writing a paper,
the more they'll
do you really
appreciate it.
start writing the paper from day one?
You know, if you don't drag it out for
write
weeks
some
and
notes,
weeks
and
and
you do
weeks,
some
they're
research,
going to
write some
appreciate
more
it.
notes,
They
you
can
do
just
some graphs, you do
get
some charts,
something,
you do some
get it
planning,
done and
you
go
make
from
an
there.
outline.
Now, it's not always
And then
the
you
case
write it
that
all
everybody
down.
can drop
Same
what
sort
they're
of
doing
thing
and
here.
stop for 2 days.
And then
have
obviously
all-day
the
meetings.
review cycle.
But
to
at the same
finish it
time,
up.
you got to weigh that out.
So
one of
let's
the big
walk through
things
this
is
a
do
little
your
bit.
homework.
Problem
Get
recognition,
information,
get documents,
is
get everything
really
you can
key.
ahead of time.
Let's
Read what
understand
you
what the
can.
problem is.
Go in
knowledgeable, and then
I'm
ask
working on
them
a
about that
project
stuff.
now.
One of the big mistakes
and
people do
so
I
much
have,
of life
a
is
problem
they
that
wait
came
for
to us in
somebody to
business
tell
that,
them the
we need
story.
to do this.
They
this,
don't
and
do the
this.
work up front to
I'm not
get
gonna go
smart
into too
enough
much
to
detail.
really use people's time
And
effectively.
so the requirement said we need to
So
do this.
that's
this, and this.
something else to
And
consider. So you have
when
to
we started looking
remember
at the system,
that interviews
doing this,
is
this, and this
only
was really
mostly
mostly
effective.
It's
You know,
it's
our
quick
system was
for
not
you,
built to do this,
but
this,
it's
and
not
this.
really quick at getting
Especially
at
in the
core
order
of
of this,
what's going on,
this, and
unless
that.
you've
Again,
you know,
I
not
said
for everything,
today.
unless you really have
Point
focus
being,
and go to the people
the
who are
real
experts
need
and
out
use
there
their
was
expertise
we
really
need
well.
the system to
And
do
so you got to watch out
what's
as
some of
well.
Bobby.
My opinion
And this
is
was
do
one
one-on-one
way to do
interviews.
what's
Don't
Bobby.
get a whole
But
group.
there was
of people
lots of
there
other
because
ways
most
to do
of
it
the
as
people
well.
won't
So
be
we
talking,
kind of came up
and
with
most of the
what
people
the really
won't care about
need
what
is.
somebody's
We wanna be
saying,
able to
or
pay
they'll
for
just
stuff.
get into fights and disagreements internally.
Okay.
It's easier to get big
The
impressions
old-fashioned
than
way is one
checking
way to
with
pay
people.
for
Do
stuff,
it
but we can
one-on-one,
also do it
or
this other
send out
way.
documents and say, "Hey,
And
review
the
this,
other
see how we're
way
talking about that." Saves us a ton of time and
so
implementation. It gets the
you have
stuff
to
delivered
understand
faster,
that when you
cheaper,
get responses from
and
somebody,
actually is
you also
less
have to
confusing
gauge
overall
their
for everybody.
worthiness as a
Because
source.
instead of creating
Are
a new
they
type of
the
a special
expert? Are
process,
they
we're
one of the
creating a
experts?
new
You know,
process
maybe you want to
altogether.
go through and see if it holds
So
true
that's the
for
type of
everybody.
thing we want to do with
because
recognize the
they're
problem.
not necessarily
We
going to
want
be
development not to
outside
get
of
stuck
everything.
on the technology there. We want to think
That's
outside
kind
the
of
box
a
in the very,
moderately structured
cliche
interview
sort of
with
way.
some
We
ideas
wanna come
inside
up
of
with
there.
thoughts of
There
how
are
do we
much more formal
really
ways of going about this stuff.
meet this need.
I'm not going to go into much
without
details
getting
here, but there's
falling
something
in
called
love with it,
JAD,
the first
Joint
idea that
Application
came
Development.
to
Where
light.
this
And so part of the
approach
way we
is
can
very
do that
popular
is do a little bit of
in that
evaluation.
you'll
We go to the
probably
environment, we can
set
look
up like
around.
a week
So
of meetings, lock
this
everybody
is
in
not
conference
as
rooms
common
for
of a
6 or 8
technique
hours a
anymore
day,
'cause
give them
software's so
lunch and
ubiquitous.
food
Most
and
of what
snacks
we
and
do
everything
is
like
we
that,
built every
and say,
system
go figure
ever.
it out.
And this can
And
be
then we just kinda
massively
tweak it.
effective,
That's the thought,
particularly
at
when
least.
run effectively.
But sometimes
like
it
we
is
talked
useful.
about. If you get
So
some
thinking
research,
about
if
it
you
30
start
years
some
ago, when
documents,
first
if you
software systems
bring
were
people
built,
together with
nothing
very
ever
focused
existed
questions,
before.
you
How do you
can
know what
really
rules
do
to go
well
implement?
with this type of
if
meeting,
you
where you can
think
get
about,
some
let's
understanding
say,
and really work through this. Now, the effective part
depositing
about
a check.
chat is
Well,
it
what
gets
used to
beyond
happen, I
just
used to
what
have
we
a
want the system
person
to do. It
who
starts
would
brainstorming as
receive the check,
what are acceptable ways
and they
to
would
solve
write
the problem.
down in a ledger
It
that
probably
this person
even
received
most
this
of the time
check
goes
with this
beyond
number
what
and
a
everything
true
else.
requirement should be.
And then
It
that
gets
check
into
would
the
be
how a little bit.
forwarded
But the
on
point
to
is,
a central
let's
processing house.
drive
somebody would
down
write it
beyond
down, and then forward it on to the
fun
bank where the
fairy
check
tale
came
sets
from,
of
where somebody would
Christmas
write it down.
lists into
And
what
then
can we really afford?
the bank would
How
say,
can
"Yep,
this really
this
be
is the
done?
amount."
What
They
are
give it
really
to the bank,
the
and they give it to the
traps
bank,
that are
and
inside of
they,
that?
money's changed.
Not every project
back and
needs a
forth behind
JAD.
the scenes.
Some projects are too
And that was all
simple
done with
or
paper.
way
There's
too
people, there's
complex to start with.
Dozens
a JAD.
or hundreds
There might be
or
a
thousands
series
of
of
people
focus
who
JADs
sat in
later
little
on.
offices
We might
and
need
read
to have
pieces of
a
paper.
group of
Every
experts
single
just
check that was written went through somebody's
cut
hand.
down
And it
all
was
the possible
moved from
choices
bank to
into
bank
something
until it got
focused
paid
before we
for.
get too crazy out there.
And so
That's
we
exactly
want to use
essentially
JAD
what happens today in the
appropriately
electronic
for the right
automated
size, for the
clearinghouse,
right
it's called
audience, for the
ACH.
right situations, where we
It's-
can bring the right.
They
people
used to have
together.
physical clearinghouses.
It doesn't do any
where
good to have the
checks were mailed around the
technical team
country,
have 8 people
and then
there,
they
and
had
the business
physical
have
clearinghouse where checks were mailed around the country and
one
then
of
typed in the
6
computers.
who really
And now
needs to
you
be
can take
there
a
at
picture of
different
your check
times
and your
in
paper
and
check
out 'cause
never
they're
even has
really
to move
busy.
from one place
So
to another.
it's
Or
a
you
great
can just give them the
technique. You have to
numbers,
use it
and they do it all electronically.
Now, but we learned
One
it
of the
by
things you're going
going
be
to
asked
the
to do
environment.
is
We learned it by
consider
watching what people do
all
and
these
writing
interviews
down
and
what
stuff.
they do and
What are some of the
analyzing what they do.
skills?
And
you
in
would
some
need to be a
cases, it
good
was efficient. In
requirements
some cases, not so much.
analyst
Automated
to be able to
clearinghouse
capture this
really is
stuff.
this clever
And I've
system.
kind of categorized this just
but not
roughly.
on
There's other
electronic
categorizations, and you're
It
going to
takes
come up
days
with a
and
lot
days and
more of
days
this.
for
So you're
Shakespeare
going
to
to
reconcile.
tell me more. And I
Because
can't
when
spell
we
it
created it,
here
we didn't
either.
have the internet.
There you go.
We had
Real-time
move
fix.
files.
So
big
there's
files.
technical
We didn't have
skills and
real-time
professional
internet. It
skills we
wasn't
can
fast
talk
enough for
about.
that sort of stuff.
So on the technical
So,
side,
just
problem
understand
solving
this
is
is not a
probably my number
flawless
one
technique.
when I think
It's-
about
it's-
this. Now,
it's
what do you
a
mean
way
problem
of
solving?
understanding
Just
the
understanding
system.
what the problem
But
is.
we
not
want to go
how.
through with synthesis.
If you
and see if we understand what's going on.
it's kind of hard
Is there a
to
way
come
to
up with
improve it?
abstract
Is there a way to
requirements.
go through it?
I'm not saying
So
you should be writing
the key
down
to being
those
able to do that
solutions,
is being able to
but
capture
you have
data.
to
And understand
how we capture data can be really
what a
tough.
solution
It could
space looks
be
like and
sitting
all the
around
different
watching
solutions that
people
are
do
out
their
there.
job.
Sometimes
That's
to be able
not
to
always
not
an
write
option,
down,
especially the system
these
never
specific
existed
solution
before.
being asked.
Nobody sat around and watched
You have to be able to
people
go through
write
and say what's the need,
notes to each other
and
and
what
came
are
up
they
with Twitter.
proposing, and what are some of the other options, and maybe do that. Now, every
There was
requirement has some
thought
solution in
process
mind
that
when you
went
write it
into
down.
some creation.
Seldom
And
do
so
we
what they
say,
do is
I
consider,
want
what do we
transportation
want?
to get me
What do we
from
want to
point
get
A
out
to
of
point
this?
B.
I mean, and Twitter's not a great
It normally
example.
falls
They build, like,
into
2
I
weeks
want a
and just
plane, I want a
bunch of
car, I
people
want to
sitting
buy a
around.
room saying this is what
Yeah,
I want.
there's
It's
exactly
some
the opposite of
place
what
you're
we're trying to
starting
do inside of
here.
it.
Or I want
But
all the
sometimes
above.
we want to sit down with people and just say,
seaplanes
hey,
and whatnot.
how do we do this? We're going to talk
so
about this a little bit. We're gonna
It's
talk
not to
about
say
how
that,
we
but
go through and
certainly
capture that data. So
you're
I'm
going to
not
have
go
to be
into it much
creative
more
within
right here.
within coming up this. It's certainly
With
a
that
design
data,
skill,
though,
but
we
it's
need
also
to
gonna
do
be
something to capture
that
the
comes into
cohesive
the
requirement. We need
requirements.
to take notes.
And
Now,
one
the
of the
next one here
great
is
things we
domain
do in
experience.
software development
It's
is
a question
take
mark
notes
in a
next to
very
this.
structured way called a
Not
model.
everybody has to
A
start
model helps us
out being an
understand the
expert to write
system. It's a
software
way of
requirements,
drawing
but you
pictures
need to
and
develop
capturing
expertise
just specific
through the
information
process
enough
if not.
to be able to help us understand
Sometimes
what
requirements
do
are
we
best
need,
not
what do
written
we,
by
you know,
experts
what's
because
essential
experts
to the
forget
system,
to
and
write
how does
stuff
it
down.
structure,
They
how is
forget
it
to make it
related
explicit.
to other parts
Requirements
of the
should be capturing
system.
enough
And so it's a great way
whoever
to get
those
a quick
developers
look at the
are
process.
don't
Now,
need to be
modeling
domain
is
experts.
normally
So
of as a
requirements might
diagram
vary.
process.
I mean,
It
I've worked
doesn't
on
have to be.
systems
There's
that
other ways
had
of making it happen.
10 pages of
And
requirements.
there's a couple
I
different
worked on the airplane
methodologies.
system
Started
had
off as structured analysis,
27,000
which is a very
individual
functional way to look
requirements.
at models, and then it's kind
Because
of moved into
it's important
object-oriented
that an airplane
analysis,
works a very
which is
specific
more of
way, a very predictable
looking
way
at
that we
the
know exactly how it
pieces and the
works.
artifacts.
So
But what's important
domain
is what goes
experience
into the
varies
model.
based off of what's going on.
Traditionally speaking, models
the
are
people who write
scaled down
requirements tend to be
versions of the real
experts.
thing. I'm not going to try and capture what every
I've worked
person
on many a
does.
system where
I'm
we
gonna capture
learned
what a
about it
taste
as
of
we
that
went.
is.
I worked on a system
The
we
scaling
worked
down
on
doesn't really
a
mean
state
much in software
food, drug, and
development
dairy
outside the
system.
fact of the
And I learned a heck of a lot about milk and
software
cheese during that project.
It's the same thing no matter what size it is. I mean,
It's not that I'm an expert in it
So
per
what we
se,
really
but I
want to
certainly
capture
gained that
here
experience along
is
the way.
the key
Now,
information.
we'll talk about it in a
the
minute, but you might want some
whole
technical
bunch of
experience in
information out
modeling.
there. Let's get
How
to
do I draw
what
models? How
information
do
do I
I
want?
approach
What
models?
data
How
am
do
I
I capture this
tracking?
information? How do I use
What
them
fields
to
are
be
people
able to
typing into
communicate?
machines
And
or
then
screens or
certainly, I think you
writing
need a
a
certain
paper
amount
and
of
reading
understanding
in?
of what systems can do.
and then what behavior
You need to be
happens
able
with
to,
that
when
data?
you write the requirements,
What's
say,
going
"Hey,
on? How
I
is that
can't
data
do that with a
changing? How
website.
is the system
I
responding to
can't
different
send
events
push
that are happening
notifications to a
inside of that?
user on a website
Both
unless
from
they have
the
the page
page
open."
I clicked on something. and also
So if you want to do this, you have to
asynchronous
gather an
comes
email,
in.
you have to gather an
By
SMS.
looking at
'cause
these
I
pieces,
can't guarantee
it
they're
gives
going
me
to
a
keep the browser
feel
open.
for what my system does.
Just
as a
understanding
whole.
those
It gives me a
capabilities
little better
can
feel
be
of what
important
I
at
want
times.
the
You have
system
to have
do.
some technical background, not necessarily
And so now that I've
super
gone through this whole
but
process,
certainly
I've
within the
considered the
expertise
options,
of your
I've
technical
gathered some
systems,
stuff.
you probably should
That's
have
all
some
the
ideas
prelude
of
work
what the
to get to
system
the
can and can't
specification.
do.
And this is
that
what we're gonna
means a
build
certain amount of
little bit
creative
here.
engineering.
We'll spend
If
a
you
little
know
bit
there's
of time
limitations
talking
to the
about some of
system, how can I come up with
these
ways
activities
to
we do,
solve
and then
this requirement?
When we get into next
and
week,
yet
we'll
not,
get into
you know,
starting to write down some
violate the
requirements.
limitations of my
And so
system.
the data is going to be
So
gathered. We're going to
requirements
arrange the
engineering
data.
is
And we're going to
normally
write down
about
in very
the
formal
yes. Contractual
you know,
language.
we
what
want to say,
want.
how do we say yes to this?
Last stage is go back.
How
and
do we
double
find
check
a way to build
When
this?
take that document,
There's a lot of
and
no's
give it
inside
to a
of there.
group of
Well, I
people
can't do
and
it
say,
that
is
way. I
this,
can't
you
do
know,
it that way.
users, is this
But
what
it's
you wanted?
constantly seeking
Developers,
yes.
can you go off and build this?
Now,
Testers,
the flip side of
do you
that
know
is
how
the
to test
professional
this stuff?
skills.
Does it make sense from that
sometimes called
standpoint?
soft skills, but not a very
Whoever,
popular term
you know,
these days.
focus groups.
So
Does this look like a great
to
product?
do
Well,
analyst
however
stuff,
wanna do
you
that.
kind of
I
have
don't
to
know
like
there.
people a little
But
bit. The idea
at
is
least
to
a
go
little bit.
through and make
You
sure
gotta
you
talk
have the
to
right
people.
information.
You got to be able to interact with
You
people.
capture
You got
it
to
in
weigh
an
ideas off
accurate
of
way
people and get
to
their
make sure you
inputs
haven't
and
missed anything
respect their
huge.
inputs.
Just basically
if
to
you
have
are one of the
final,
technical
like,
types
yep,
that
this
just
is what
really
we wanna
knows
do,
how it should
sign
be
off
done, you
and
don't
go
care what
from
anybody else
there.
thinks.
So
This might not be the field that you want to go in.
one
too
other
much
note
on.
inside of here, as we're
Because
going
you got to
through
communicate
and
a lot,
looking at
both
requirements
orally and
capture
written.
and all
The
that
interviews we
sort
talked
of,
about. It's probably you sitting down with
approach,
somebody.
but then you
is
have to take those
we
notes. You have
want
to write them
to
up. You have to share those with
not
people.
just
so that
capture
is really an
what
important
we're gonna
aspect
do
of
for
this
the
job.
requirements.
And
But
a little
try
bit
and
of
capture where
negotiation.
those requirements came from.
You might be
Is there
negotiating between
some
two
previous
parts of the team who
implementation?
want something
Is there some
different.
previous
I must do
documentation
this. It's
that's
got to do
coming
that.
from?
What's
You know,
the
you gotta get
history
to
that
some
gets
requirement.
to
You can't
that?
go on
Because
forever.
as I was
So
mentioning
maybe you have to
before,
find some way to be able
sometimes
to
we
go back and
have
forth.
and then
There's
some
a ton of
need that was
organizations
there a
that
long
go
time
on.
ago.
You
It's
got
not really
a lot of
needed
data
anymore.
coming in.
There's a
You
law
not only
that
have to
got
keep track
repealed.
of all this data, you
There's
got to figure
a
out what's
lawsuit
important,
doesn't work
what's
here
less
anymore.
important, and organize it in
There's
such a way that
a
you
risk that
document
didn't
it
turn out to
cleanly,
be
that you
realistic.
know what you did and didn't decide, how you didn't decide.
You're afraid that
what you did.
There's so much
wouldn't
information to
hold
go
that
off and
much data,
capture.
or
So that
organization
organization solid state
really
was going to be a
of
along
flaky
the way.
technology. Well, it's fine. It's
So let's
working.
talk a
It's
minute
great.
about
I mean, it's
modeling
actually better
before
than
we
the other
wrap up
discs.
here.
So
So there's
we don't
two
need
kind
this
of
backup
branches of
process
modeling.
running
We're not going to
4
go
times
into
a day
it
now.
too
We can
much
do it
here,
once
but I
a
want to
week.
give you an introduction. So
That's the
structured
type of
analysis
thing we
is
wanna
the
understand.
old-fashioned one.
Beyond
It's
that,
excellent for
consider
systems that are
actually
procedural,
starting to build
that
this
can do
stuff while you're
functional
doing the requirements. Build
decomposition,
a
that really
prototype
have a
of user
clear flow to
interfaces.
break it down.
Doesn't have to be
It's
functional.
I worked for a company where we
Object
did
oriented is the
requirements
new
in
fact
3
stuff.
days. It's how I
We
break
had a
down the
meeting
world
based off of what I see. What are
we
the real objects?
wrote
out
some
there?
stuff up,
and it's really good at
understanding what I'm
3
not
days is
seeing.
well,
in the
I mean, we
system.
deliver them at the end of the
Procedural
week.
systems,
I mean,
we had a meeting.
Structured systems are good for.
Then we would
I got
write
a
stuff
process
up the
this is
next
what I do
day,
step by step.
build up some
Object oriented
screens.
is following
like,
day,
a
and then
world, a
and then
system.
ship it
I'm
off
not
for
sure of
review.
all that's in there. Let's go off and
It
see
was
what the
a
holes
huge
are.
project. It would take
And
a
it
week,
works
but
really well with the
it's-
modern
the
implementation.
whole idea
of
was
those as well.
instead of taking 6
So,
months to go off and
as
build
a quick
requirements, we were
picture,
trying to
just so
get
you
done
can see
in
what
a
it
week.
looks
It
like,
was
structured
something. We were
analysis
trying to
is
be
these
fancy.
bubble diagrams. They look
And
a lot
part
like
of that
flow
was we
charts.
built out
It's a
the screens.
decomposition of
It was
I
HTML
want to
where you
go
click the button
and cook a
didn't
meal.
actually do anything,
So I
just
go
stick to the next
shopping,
screen that
I
looked
click
executed
some
something.
food, then I eat.
Didn't
the
actually
food.
take the data you
Those-
typed in
no,
and do anything
there's a
with
big
that data.
process cooking
Cook a
meal.
meal.
It's all
I know the
pre-canned
steps
data. It was
along
all
the way.
very
I'm going to
fundamental
document
law.
it. I'm going to document
But
the flow
that
that's
allowed
going
us
inside
to
of here.
really
I
see
really
what
wanted
the
to break
system
the
would look
system
like.
down to the smaller parts.
So we want to
and
be able to
understand it
go
from
off
there,
and take
then
a
get
look
my
at it, and
requirements
not
based
just
off
deal
this
with
breakdown.
words and abstractions.
Where
And then we want to
object-oriented
really
is a bunch of
understand
different views.
beyond
So
just what
if you're
the
watching a
requirements are,
baseball
what's the priority
game,
of the
it's a
requirements?
totally different
Sometimes
view
they
if
can't
you're
get
sitting
everything
behind
done
the
in
home
the time
plate
frame.
than if you're sitting out
So
in the
if
bleachers.
up front as you're writing
You can't
it,
see
give
and
a
call
priority
balls and
like, hey,
strikes
this
from
is absolutely
the left
essential.
field
This is
line.
nice to have. This can come
You
later
can
on.
do that from the home
I don't
field.
really care about this, but it might be
home plate.
nice.
But you might not
Then
be able to
that'll
see if
give you
a
a feel
ball
to
is
help
fair
drive
foul and a home run if
the
you're sitting
priorities
behind
of
home
how
plate,
things get done.
depending on which
So
side
as
of
you be able
home
to
plate
hand
you're
off
on.
those priorities.
So we need a bunch of
and
different
especially
views
if
to be
you're
able to
dealing with
see
a
the whole
contract
game.
instead of somebody going off.
So
and
we're going to learn
telling
a
you it's $1
lot
million
about this
system.
One
to
of the
even
things
get
we'll talk
started.
about is use
Maybe you
cases.
can say
A use
okay,
case
it's
is kind of a
$100,000 to get
big
started, but all the rest
menu of
add-ons
everything
are
the system
another
does. It tells me who are the users of the
So you just
system,
do-
what are the
instead of
pieces
just saying,
of
I'm
the
not gonna do the
system, and
project,
what
I
can I
do
do
it
with
a little
each of
bit
those
different way.
pieces.
I
It's a
do
really
it
useful
a
tool
little bit
for
at a
understanding
time.
the big picture of the system.
All right. So that's
An activity diagram
hopefully
gets
give you
into
a feel
that
for
flow
why
we
we're
were
talking
here.
about.
These are the steps.
From
that's
here, we
going
want to
on.
go into
so between
some
the two
other,
pieces of the
what do
system,
we do
who's
to
doing which
flesh
steps,
this out?
and
That's
what
what
is
we
the
do in the
flow of
future
them,
videos.
what are the decisions
Take a
that are
break,
going on inside
come
there.
back,
Give us
and
that
watch some
next
of those
level of
videos.
information, and then the class diagram gives us the big picture of what does my data look like. How do I describe the data? What's the relationships between data? And maybe even somewhat of the behavior that's going on inside of here. So class diagrams give us that little bit of feel. Hopefully you've seen this from some of your coding classes beforehand, but this is the big picture. So all of this comes down to you going out, being inquisitive, writing stuff down, and getting enough information to go off and specify the system. So this week, we're focusing on the process. We're going to document that process. Next week, we're going to get into what do we build and how do we document that. But we got a good start. So think about now which of these tools you want to use to go off and elicit your requirements.